Professor Kristofer Helgen is a zoologist, renowned for his daring expeditions to far-flung corners of the globe. He's found dozens of previously undiscovered species of mammal. When he's not out in the field, he's looking for clues for his next adventure in the back rooms of world museums. I found him in a dusty space full of animal skeletons, deep in the bowels of London's famous Natural History Museum. Chris, I've been allowed behind the scenes at the Natural History Museum, which is where you work, trawling through the archives here, looking for, not necessarily new species, but undiscovered species. Is that right?
Well, that's right. They might not be new in the sense they've just evolved, but they may have been overlooked by science until now. That's one of my specialties as a zoologist is, uncovering these pieces of the tree of life, in my case for mammals, that have gone overlooked so far by science.
What's your most memorable discovery, if I can ask you that?
Yeah, there's many that stand out. I think that my favorite is of an animal that I came to call the olinguito. This is a gorgeous creature. It's adorable. It has this fluffy, long fur. It's related to a raccoon. And the story starts in a place just like this, where we're sitting, behind the scenes of the Natural History Museum. Now, set the stage, here we are, Max. When people come to the museum, they're usually envisioning the galleries out front, right? They're seeing a dinosaur, a skeleton, the blue whale. Here, it's quiet. All we have are these cabinets, and this is where the magic happens for me. This is where specimens from expeditions, decades, centuries past, specimens collected by Darwin himself, Teddy Roosevelt, Alfred Russel Wallace, they're to be found along with many others. So I was in the Field Museum in Chicago, which is one of the great natural history museums, and I was studying members of the raccoon family. Long story, but one of my favorite groups of mammals, and I pulled out a drawer. Big metal drawer, heavy. I pulled it out, and it stopped me in my tracks because I saw these gorgeous red, brown, fluffy furs, and they were like no member of the raccoon family I'd ever seen. Now, I've spent many years, my whole life almost, training myself to know by sight, anatomy, external appearance, almost every mammal on the planet, right? And so when I see something that I don't instantly recognize, it sets off a trigger for me. It says, oh my goodness, what is this? There were some boxes next to these pelts, these skins, that had skulls in them. So you imagine I pull a lid off a box, I look a little closer, and I say, wow, the shape of these molars is something like I've never seen. The way that the ear bones are housed at the back of the skull, this is something I haven't seen. This is how I work. And I said, could it be that this is an animal that all zoologists had overlooked until now? A long story short, I worked it all through kind of as a detective in the museum, and indeed it was. So we studied the animal's DNA. We studied its anatomy. This was, quite a substantial branch of evolution in this group of mammals that had gone undetected. I used the information, this had been in the museum for more than 50 years, information on the tags to sort of pick a place, and this is often how I work too, to go out into the wild, see if we could find it. Kind of a needle in a haystack mission. The very first night we went to a protected area in Ecuador and we found this animal alive in the wild.
That's crazy. So what on earth went through your mind when you saw it?
I mean, it's a literal eureka moment, incredible, as it was in the museum to start with, as it was as we worked through the genetic results, there all the way to this moment in the forest itself. And that is usually how I work. I work taking in two places. I work in the most remote natural areas that are left on our planet, the wildest places you can imagine, and in the great natural history museums of the world. So that turned out to be a species new to science, called the olinguito. We gave it its scientific name for the first time in 2013. I had a big press conference. We announced it. We had pictures of the animal, just glorious. And imagine how exciting this is for me as a scientist. I'm there to introduce it at least formally to the scientific community, the global public for the first time. Some people fell in love with this animal, especially down in Colombia and Ecuador, where it was from. And a day after the announcement, a week, a month, my inbox starts filling up with messages, and people are asking questions. They're sending me pictures. They say, is this an olinguito? Or is this an olinguito? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But we're talking about school kids and school classes and bird watchers and national park rangers. And within a year, we did another announcement where we were able to tell the world a lot more about the olinguito, not from work that I'd done, but from information that the world had sent back to me. And so you kind of unleash any scientific discovery onto the world, and sometimes it kind of comes back at you with interest in this glorious way.
Someone must have seen one before.
Right.
So why had it not been identified as a separate species?
Right. Great question. How is it that one of this this amazing, adorable, distinctive animal goes till 2013 to get its scientific name? Well, obviously, for thousands of years, people have lived alongside this animal, so there must be some kinds of indigenous knowledge of it. That said, it's not clear that anyone has given it a name that's unique to it, or that it has distinguished it. What we found is it's usually confused with other animals that live up in trees at night, like it does. So night monkeys, kinkajous. There's another animal that's somewhat similar, related to raccoons, called an olingo. All of these can live in the same forest. But, like anything in science, oftentimes these discoveries happen by kind of looking a little closer at what we thought we know. How many of these creatures are in this forest, and make it tick? Well, scratch the surface and we found there's another one, and it's a very special animal.
And in this age of people being so concerned about conservation, you're actually bringing moments of happy news in that sort of world of darkness quite often.
Right, absolutely, and there are so many reasons to be concerned about nature and conservation. And yes, of course, that is what attracts a lot of the attention. This is a happy story, and in several ways that you might not expect. One is that ultimately we've determined this is not an endangered species, this particular animal, the olingito. We know it has a wide enough distribution, it lives in enough protected areas, there's enough numbers of them out there that, while we're concerned for its very specific cloud forest habitats, they often will, be cut down with human impact. At the moment, it seems somewhat secure. The other thing that was really wonderful about that is that there's a lot of different remarkable creatures that live in these specific cloud forest habitats. This is the only place where the olingito lives. And that boost that we got after this announcement about this, beautiful animal was something that, especially down in Colombia and Ecuador, was able to sort of be a flag that was raised to accentuate the importance of this particular habitat. So a happy story in a lot of ways.
And how did you come up with the name?
Well, it's chosen as a Spanish name, derived. So the animal that most people living there, and scientists as well, had confused it with in the past is called an olingo, also an obscure animal. But so we called it sort of the little olingo in Spanish, the olingito.
So
yeah.
It's a wonderful job. I mean, there'll be so many people listening, so jealous, ultimate thing to sort of discover, really, even better than treasure. It's not the sort of job you'd consider.
My kind of treasure, yeah.
It's not the sort of job you'd consider, though, growing up, because you'd assume that everything's been discovered. So how did you end up doing it?
Right. No, you do. And people are constantly sort of surprised that you can do this, in this day and age. It might not surprise people that we could go into the depths of the ocean trenches and find something new to science, or maybe count up the insects in the canopy of an Amazonian rainforest. But yes, the truth is there are all kinds of aspects of natural history that are very little known even in our world today. So I grew up in Minnesota in the United States, in the northern part, up north near Canada, and I was fascinated with animals from my earliest days. And like many kids are, of course, I loved cats and dogs and horses, but it was more than that. And it was more than a young obsession that many people have with dinosaurs or something similar. But, there were commonalities to those kinds of things we often see. But for me, as a little kid, a little thought flew into my mind. It was a big idea, too big for a little kid's head, but it was, how many are there? And I just remember from my earliest days thinking about that. Well, I could see that there's horses and there's zebras, and they're similar. But wait, how many kinds are there? And similarly, okay, there's dogs and there's wolves and coyotes, but how many are there? And as a kid, in this sort of organic way, I would make lists and notebooks, and as I grew up, I'd list the things I'd found in children's books or seen at the museum or gone to the zoo, and the lists grew. And of course, as I could read more and more, they became more developed and more mature and even more technical. As I'd order from the local library, I grew up in Coon Rapids, Minnesota. I'd put in orders at the library for special volumes about mammals, and they'd arrive, and it'd be this great day for me. But ultimately, in some very real way, that idea never left my head, and that's what I still do. On the frontiers of the wildernesses of the world and in these great natural history museums, I'm still after the answer to that question, how many are there? And I've named about 40 species of mammals as new to science in my career so far, and I have a lot more in the pipeline.
So you're an example of someone who decided what they wanted to do and did it, or someone that just followed their passion and, it took you here? Yeah,
well, that's certainly part of it. I mean, there's a great luckiness in my story in that, I am one of these folks that caught a hold of an idea or a passion early on and have had, the ability to, every time there's any kind of fork in the road, big or small, look at that and choose the path of life that's going to take me closer to that goal. And I've been able to do that. So I've had that drive, and that passion is important. In the United States growing up, you're especially told to follow your passion. That's good advice to some extent. I think, of course, I've grown up in science now and spent many years as a scientist, and I like to observe how people's careers proceed and, how students come into the field and how well they do. It's something I think a lot about. And passion is just part of that equation, that drive, that sort of aspect of the heart, and, what motivates you in that powerful emotional way. But in science, too, what you need is to couple that with precision. Sort of you've got the passion, you also have the precision. And so, if you're going to be successful in science, you're really going to need to, let that passion drive you, but cultivate, very carefully, over long hours and, long periods of apprenticeship and trial and error and different experiences, the technical skills that are going to allow you to, be as good as you can be. And that's going to be different in every kind of field. That might be a quantitative, mathematical approach. That might be, getting to know the mammal anatomies, that I need to know, that sort of thing. But those have to be married together: the passion, precision, the heart, and the head, and they're both necessary. And it's even more than that. Both of those, and I think and this is not just about science. I mean, you could think about. I love music. A concert pianist or a professional violinist. The greats are going to be those that marry those things together. The great, incredible drive, the emotion, the passion, but also are technically brilliant, are absolutely at the top of their game in terms of precision. So both have to be there. Both have to be there in spades, but they also have to be tightly balanced. If one gets the better of anybody. It drives things in a spiral, and so burnout is something to be aware of in everybody's career, and we see that in science too. People with great passions, can sometimes be driven almost to the edge, and the same can be true. People who have an unbelievable set of technical skills, but not quite the heart to keep that burning. They also may not get there, and so I think. It's like that in science. It's probably like that in many fields. Maybe it's like that in journalism too. But I think all of us need to make sure that drive is coupled, with something that we're just very, very good at, and that takes cultivation.
You're an example of someone who decided what they wanted to do, and you got there. But were you open to opportunities along the way as well? Were you flexible as well to new ideas and new paths as well, or did you close yourself off to other potential sort of avenues of interest?
Yeah, well, great question, and I think that's really, really important. I think that I always had an idea of where I was going, and to some extent it was very simple, very naive. That was to study mammals, and particularly that I again was fascinated with the diversity, the richness of life. How many mammals are there? But that took different forms at different parts of my life. When I was very young, 3 and 4, I loved animals. My parents used to tell me, I said I wanted to be a farmer. I wanted to be, hands-on with animals. That evolved into, eventually, even at a very young age, knowing that I wanted to be a zoologist. And that's something that maybe I learned about watching television, or especially reading something like National Geographic, those things that are accessible maybe to you as a kid growing up in the Midwest. But I knew that's where I wanted to go. Now, what that would look like, I wasn't sure for a while. I thought, okay, am I going to, be someone that I see on TV who's, wrestling wild animals and, studying them in some way like that? Is it going to be, I thought a lot about, being driven by a passion for conservation, right, in our endangered world, and am I going to work for a zoo or for a wildlife organization like that? It was when I went to university that things really crystallized for me. These questions about how many mammals are there, I realized there was one very, very key way to answer that, and that was to work in natural history museums. And I went to Harvard. It's something that was very unusual in my family. We kind of come from a close-knit Norwegian-American Lutheran family in Minnesota, and I was the first to kind of leave the state and go somewhere else. And I went to Harvard almost kind of naively, not because it's it has a tremendous reputation, because of course it does, but for a different reason. One, I had read as a teenager a book by famous scientist, American scientist Edward Wilson, E.O. Wilson, this grand figure in the study of the richness of life, and it's called Naturalist, and he writes in that book about working at a place called the Museum of Comparative Zoology. And as soon as I saw that kind of turn of phrase, I thought, wow, there is such a place. What could be more of a draw, more of a mecca than the Museum of Comparative Zoology? That absolutely stuck in my head. I did pretty well in school, and as things worked, a couple decades ago in the United States, you do well in school, you start to get these flyers in the mail for different universities, and all of a sudden there's an envelope from Harvard, and this is the first moment where it occurs to me, this came to me, it's addressed to me, maybe I should apply. And in that entire naivety, I applied, I got in, and then I went off to the Museum of Comparative Zoology. The years I spent at Harvard were entirely ensconced in that museum. I got to meet and work with people like Edward Wilson and Stephen Jay Gould, these people who were really important in my world. And most importantly of all, I got to get my hands on cabinets and specimens behind the scenes, and that's where I developed that technical expertise in mammalogy.
We talk about Harvard and also, the greatest natural history museums in the world where you work, greatest universities in the world, and a lot of people look at that and think, wow, that's just the ultimate sort of CV, but the way you're describing it, you weren't going around collecting these brands, you were really focused on the work, and actually you weren't intimidated by Harvard because you didn't have that sort of history surrounding you and your family.
That's exactly right. I think it was an unusual path for me because the path, as you're kind of saying, wasn't the drive at all. What it was the sort of, the mission of getting to where I wanted to be, which was to, be someone who could have a global command of mammalogy and studying it in this way. And so that's where I learned, like I said, at university, that is something that really had to happen in natural history museums. But I also learned that at the same time, there's a certain paucity to that. There's only so much you can learn. In libraries and even in museums. You also, if you're going to really get to know animals, you have to get out into the field and study them in these wild places. And so I think, that has been, a secret formula for me all along is being willing to join and lead expeditions to all these phenomenal places around the world, as well as, do the kind of sometimes tedious work behind the scenes for years at a time, working through the answers to these questions by making comparisons in museums.
You talk about colleagues having breakdowns like they do in other industries. They're very driven, aren't they? Because it's so hard to get a job like yours. Have you considered, what it is that does drive you and, the positive and negative of that?
No, I have. It can be hard to put your finger on, and sometimes it's not, something, a box that I open and look at too closely. But I think that part of it runs deep to those early days where, as I mentioned, I was motivated and interested by concepts of conservation and, the idea of a changing world, an endangered world, more and more as I, learned so much as a kid about the language of mammalogy, the Latin names of things, the terminologies that I started to sort of learn as a language. I also learned that so many of these species were endangered animals, and so that was a driving factor always along, as kind of thinking about where our world is going and whatnot. So that's kind of a higher aspirational aspect. I think that I read so much as a child, and like I said, I was reading about scientists like Edward Wilson and others, and I was very inspired, and I was motivated by that. And I think that I wanted to, I felt a drive to go to a different kind of place, to leave where I was born, leave my kind of home area. I had read so much about, as kids do, adventures and explorations, and there's a grandiose romance to such things that probably most of us grow up enough that we kind of leave that at the door. But I was really motivated by that. Is this a world where we can still explore and make discoveries like this? And many people along the way quite seriously told me that it was not, right? That we must know most of the mammals already, of course, maybe all of them, that, even if I could make a discovery or two like that, that would be the end of it. People also gave me all kinds of advice along the way, like, this kind of biology is antedated. This is not the future. You want to be studying molecular biology, or you want to be, working on the cure for cancer, or things like that. You get a lot of advice as a scientist. But for me, that romance aspect of exploration was something that drove me too.
So a bit of a fear of not seeing the wider world, seeing the world and everything that was there, even beyond what we knew.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Right, exactly. Early on, a drive for me, this is something I usually don't talk about, but everyone kind of pegs me as someone who's had this early passion for animals. But there's almost an equal passion growing up in my mind for geography. And what I've done, of course, is found the perfect marriage of those two things too, to explore them. I have worked in so many countries around the world, and these spots on the map that are often kind of blank spots for zoology, and that's been wonderful. But yeah, I think fear, as you say, it can be a motivator. Maybe it's not the best motivator. I mean, fear can be both powerful motivator towards positive goals. It can also be debilitating, right? It can also be crippling. It can be, a trauma that kind of keeps us stuck in place. But yeah, I think that people are afraid. I think people are terrified of all kinds of things in their lives. I think a lot of scientists are too. I think I was terrified of, of not being relevant. I knew I wanted to be a scientist, and I wanted to, be in the ranks of things that I'd read about, be someone who, made their life count and who made great discoveries, or, perhaps I was afraid of, not failing, but just never trying. And so that, I think, has definitely driven me out of Minnesota from my early days onward, and continuing to explore all kinds of things. But
it could have held you back, though, as well, couldn't it? You could still be there thinking, I'm going to succumb to this fear, but actually you used it to motivate you.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's funny. It almost kind of works in an opposite way to what you might expect. So a lot of the work that I've done has been in very difficult to work places, places like Papua New Guinea, where I've worked for many, many years. And some of those, situations that I've come across working in remote places have been really difficult, and the kinds of things that are truly terrifying often, working with, communities who might be going through conflicts, or, sometimes working with dangerous animals. Never have I had a fear of that sort of thing as something that would hold me back. Again, if there is a fear, and I don't know if that's the right word, I would rather we're motivated by, by more positive things like hope, etc. But the fear, if there was one, then was of not trying, of not getting outside of my comfort zone, not exploring.
Chris, thank you so much. We're in the bowels of your motivation, but also of this amazing museum. It's wonderful to see. Thank you so much.
An absolute pleasure, Max.